Welcome back. That was a really nice 15 minutes in my life. I hope it was a nice 15 minutes in all of your lives.
Very good.
So we are going to pick back up sports wagering, H127. Tucker made some amendments based on previous conversations we had, and I think other people had questions. And then Pat has a fiscal note for us. I'm thinking that given that we have 30 minutes to have this conversation, it might make sense to actually start with the fiscal note and get through it and then talk about the bill. Does that work for both of you? Okay, cool. Excellent. Flying
Keeping us on our
into that.
toes.
Keeping us on our toes, flying into town meeting break.
Is that? I'm getting when I click on the thing, it gives me a page not found.
Refresh.
When in doubt, refresh.
When in doubt, refresh. I was just thinking about getting that tattooed on her forehead.
No.
Got it.
Saoirse actually has a better life to live than that, but
All right, we'll just staple it there.
we'll just make a little sign.
It's not
We'll
nice.
make a little sign.
You're salty too.
Sorry about any of that, Saoirse, that I caused. Does everyone have the document up now?
Yes.
Great.
All right, pulling up so. All right, so Patrick Titterton, Joint Fiscal Office. I sent a new fiscal note based on some language that Tucker is going to go into a little more detail with you all after me. But there have been a couple of minor changes that, will have a little bit of effect mostly on the side of the fee revenue spectrum. I will share my screen so we can look at the fiscal note for this. And the good news is today, all of the most important information are in tables. So it'll be nice, neat, and compact for you all to look at.
Thanks for adjusting to us.
So I don't know, do we want to start from like a general overview and then get to the numbers, or should we jump right in?
Do folks remember our previous conversation about sports wagering? It's okay if you don't. We've gone through 12 different things this week. Okay, great. So no, just go.
Okay. So one of the recent changes was that there's a new minimum revenue share of 20% and a new fee schedule. So if we just scroll on down, we're looking at a range here between 20%, 50% for the revenue share. An important note on the fiscal year 24 estimates is that we and DLL are expecting they'd be able to have this market live sometime around the start of the new year, so in January. So when you're looking at that particular fiscal year, we're really just capturing 6 months of activity. And under the assumption that revenues are going to be collected on a monthly basis, like they are for cannabis excise, sales and use, meals and rooms, you're really only going to be looking at 5 months worth of revenue there because there's a lag. So January revenues will actually be collected in February and so on. So at 20% for 5 months of revenue collection, we're estimating about 1.3 million. And then for a full year at that revenue share rate, so starting in fiscal year 25, when you'd have all 12 months, along with the more mature market, we're estimating just shy of 4.6 million. Now, we've seen there's a spectrum that people can expect to get from, or like a spectrum of revenue share rates. So sort of on the top end of what we've seen is that 50% rate. And so here, again, for fiscal year 24, 5 months worth of actual revenue, we're estimating about 2 million. And then for a full year, more mature market in fiscal year 25, that would increase to about 10.6 million. So I'll pause there. If there are any questions about the numbers or how we came to them. I guess.
Yes, we.
Only my recollection of the testimony from folks who already had started and also additionally from operators who lent us their expertise, there's an interconnection between how many operators and the likely outcome of the revenue share percentage. How have you modeled that? Because as I recall, the testimony was, I don't want to say all over the place, but clearly people had preferences and had theories about the relationship. So where did you come down with that? Because you obviously had to resolve that issue in order to come to a dollar figure.
Yeah, so the understanding is that, operators are likely to accept sort of a much higher revenue share or a higher revenue share towards the top end of the spectrum. If they're able, if there's one or two or three, like fewer operators, they may be more willing to accept a higher revenue share. But if you're getting more towards the 6, I know that's the cap in this bill, they're probably more willing to accept a lower because, some of that comes down to market share capture. One thing we have seen though is that, so we had this sort of matrix earlier where we had, a competitive market at a low and a high tax rate. Generally speaking, other states that, have a lower tax rate in a competitive market, the total handle in those states, and so therefore the handle per capita, and so the handle is the total value of bets made, tends to be higher, so more activity. So you'll see here in these estimates that 20% versus 50%, the estimate is not 40%, for 20% is not 40% of what 50% is. I just threw a bunch of percentages out there. Sorry. So the proportion, it's you'll see it's less than, the 20% is more than half of our 50% estimate. So it's not like I took.
Not linear.
It's not linear, right? Thank you. So yeah, the lower tax rate, which we often see with more operators in the market, does tend to lead to more activity. The more activity we would expect, you'd make up a little bit of ground from not having as high a tax rate, essentially. So it's kind of a balancing act between overall activity in the market and what the tax rate applied to it is, because you could have a lower activity rate. I assume it's having some problems, but it looks like I'm still not sharing. Sorry. Is that working now?
Yes.
Okay. So does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. You're basing it on a highly competitive and a high rate model.
Well, there's the spectrum here. I did make some adjustments to what we'd assume the handle would be based on that 20% lower rate. So, if you land anywhere in between, where we assume you land somewhere between these estimates. Yeah.
Thank you.
Good. So there is a new fee schedule, and it is based on, so the lowest rate is based on what DLL says they would need to operate and regulate this market. Before, the idea was that you just have this flat rate no matter how many operators there are, and that would apply. They'd split it evenly depending on how many there were. In this schedule here, you're still starting at that base point of 550,000, and I've included. So the bill does say 2 to 6, right? But there are some instances when 1 could be selected. So that base rate, the lowest possible fee, is still going to be 550,000, and that applies to if there's 1 or 2. But from there, as you get up to 6, the fee steps up in increments of 50,000. And at the same time, you'll see that the fee per operator is actually going down. So more money in fee revenue for more operators, but the more operators there are, the less fees each one paying.
And so that sort of keeps the discipline of how we like to do fees, while still acknowledging the department's sort of testimony that it won't cost them that much more to have multiple operators.
Great. So the last piece of fiscal significance here has to do with the problem gambling fund. If you remember, 5% of revenues to DLL are set to be transferred into this fund. And in years 1 and year 2, there are minimum floors that have to be deposited into that account. In the first year, so fiscal year 24, that amount would need to be 250,000. In the second year, the minimum floor raises to 500,000, and that floor sort of continues moving forward.
Bless you.
Based on these revenue projections, if there's a 20% revenue share, so basing it on that year 1 estimate that I showed, the 5% of that would be about $65,000. So that's well below that 250,000 floor. So in that instance, you'd go above and beyond the 5%, so you'd hit the floor, and that money would come out of, money that would have otherwise been directed to the general fund. In year 2, based on those estimates, 5% of that's about 230,000. So again, that's below the 500,000 floor. And so again, the difference would be made up from money that would have otherwise been directed to the general fund. At 50% revenue share rate, you still are not quite getting there in the first year. 5% of the revenue estimate is about 100,000. So again, the gap would need to be filled. But based on the projection for year 2, so fiscal year 25, the 5% would actually be above the floor. So that full amount would be going into the problem gambling fund. So that's all the sections that have fiscal significance here, and all the changes that have been made. So unless there are any other questions, you guys have all made my life incredibly easy this morning.
Great, that's what we live for. Thank you. Tucker, you're up. Thanks.
All right, good morning. Tucker Anderson, Office of Legislative Counsel. From what I understand, you should be able to pull up a draft of the committee's amendment on the committee page. Should be draft 1.1 of the committee's amendment to H127. I'll walk you through the 4 instances of amendment. Should go fairly quickly because they're straightforward, and you just got great background from Pat. So the first 2 instances of amendment are technical corrections that were flagged by Representative Taylor during the initial walkthrough. So the first adds the terms "that are" in a clause that defines what the mobile sports wagering platform is, to make sure that this is accurately describing the combination of data networks, hardware, and software, instead of just saying that any location that uses the internet could be defined as a platform. So thank you for that, Representative Taylor. The second instance of amendment corrects an incorrect internal reference in subdivision 15. Third instance of amendment, this is substantive. This is the new structure for the fees that Pat just described. Within section 1320, which describes the competitive bidding process and some of the duties of sports wagering operators, in subsection C is struck in its entirety and replaced with the following: that the department shall assess an annual operator fee that is based on the number of operators that are accepted through the process, and that the fees shall be assessed as follows: for 1 operator, $550,000; for 2 operators, $275,000 per operator. So those are the first 2 categories Pat described as being the 550 level. For 3, $200,000 bumps you up to $600,000 total. For 4, $162,500 per operator, which gets you up to $650,000 if my maths are mathing. Next.
We just had the math, so you don't, you're welcome to
Great.
math for us if you want to, but it's not necessary.
I was a mathlete in high school, but I will stop adding increments of $50,000 for you all.
Any trophies you want to bring in and show us? Do it.
I will bring in my Waxman's Challenge trophy, the Discrete Mathematics and Computer Science Award from Rutgers University. It's a junior in high school. All right.
Representative Brannigan.
Wow.
Tucker, you can't see, but Representative Brannigan is smiling hugely behind you about all of this. Yes.
A union man.
These matter for your whole life.
For 5 operators, 140,000, and for 6 operators, 125,000 per operator. Okay. The fourth instance of amendment, this is the addition of the minimum revenue share requirement. So in the same section, 1320, in subsection D, where there is the requirement that the operators pay the revenue share that is agreed to through the competitive bidding process, a new clause is added that states that that shall be paid provided that the revenue share shall not be less than 20% of adjusted gross sports wagering revenue, which, if you recall, is defined at the beginning of the bill as all revenue less the federal excise taxes paid, winnings paid to the consumer, and any voided bets.
I'm two sort of more technical flags that have come up. One is a joint fiscal recommendation or pointing, I don't want to call it recommendation, pointed out that for cannabis and a few other taxes, we have them remitted monthly. And so that probably makes sense for cash flow on this. And I don't think that's explicitly in the bill yet.
It is not explicitly in the bill, but that's an amendment where we could add the terms on a monthly basis within the requirement for the payment of the revenue share.
Great. And then I had a request from appropriations that we would, that there wouldn't be an appropriation to start this off, but in fact, the fund would sort of, the special problem gambling fund would be funded against sort of future revenues, the way we actually started the cannabis, it's not called cannabis prevention, whatever that thing is called, the cannabis bill. Representative Andrews and then Sims.
This is sort of off track from what you've put in the amendments, but thank you for your work on that. It was brought up to me that we might want to put something in this bill because everybody who will be in this market will be using a bank account versus a credit card. Some language to protect people who have a joint account, say with their spouse, for example, like maybe some mechanism to get approval from the joint bank account holder to protect families. Yeah, I wish it was my work. That was not my idea, but it was a good one.
There's fair.
Thank you, Josie, love it. Full credit.
So at first blush, something to flag there is I'm not certain whether that sort of information can be gathered through a routing and checking account number, for example, used to set up an account. If it can, and we find that out, can certainly build that into this bill. There's an overarching confidentiality provision that governs customer information for banks. It's in Title VIII. There are certain exceptions to that mandatory confidentiality where customer information and data can be shared with parties. So if it is the case that you would have to get access to some sort of additional customer data in order to verify whether it's a joint bank account or an individual account, you'd have to amend that Title VIII provision to allow the banks to actually transmit that information to the operators.
So I have two people with hands up. Before that, I guess, in order to find out ways that the sort of intent of this would be workable, would you recommend that, Tucker, you've sort of sat through a lot more testimony on this than we have. Would you recommend the commissioner or the wagering industry or Chris Delia from the Banking Association? Should we just haul them all in, have them problem solve it with us?
I think that the industry may know a lot about what information they can get when an individual sets up an account using their bank information. And I know that Chris Delia has brought up the Title VIII confidentiality provisions in other committees that I've been in recently. So I know that he will know about what sort of confidential data can be shared and with whom.
Okay, we will follow up both of them. Representative Matos, Representative Maslin, Representative, are you on this topic?
Yeah.
Because you have a new topic, right? Okay.
Yeah, I was just thinking, I just don't see how it's even plausible to do that because it's a joint account and you both have authorized access to it. And then in the grand scheme of things, say you can pass that, a person could just take the money in the joint account, put it into their own account, and then put it into the sports betting. And that would circumvent the whole thing.
So I think we can look into it. I mean, I think the intent is really,
No, the intent's awesome, yeah.
yeah. I agree that the logistics of it might be challenging. Representative Maslin, were you on this or something else?
Yeah, I just wondered if we could specify a bill and it can't use a joint account without
Yeah.
explicit
That's exactly it.
authorization from other parties on the account or something like
Just
that.
no joint account.
Yeah,
It's just an idea.
It's an idea,
What
yeah.
happens if you both bet? You wanna use your joint account?
Her and her.
We're gonna do one person at a time. Representative Anthony is next.
I was going to go there,
Okay.
that we ought to limit, if you want to use a credit card as opposed to having a balance with the bookie, then what you would do is use an account that is solo. That is to say, single name account, period.
And we
One
can't,
complications on
we
complications.
can't ever use credit cards. That's not allowed in this bill. But I think rather than us all brainstorming how the banking industry works, we might be
Yeah.
better served by checking in with the folks in the know on this one and then coming back to Tucker with a recommendation.
Another way to approach this that I can get some information for you on, this was brought up in House Government Operations, is whether a protective order could be used to add a person to the exclusion list. So for example, if a spouse was worried about the joint bank account being emptied, they could apply for a protective order to say this individual needs to be put on the exclusion list for this period of time until we can figure out how to keep the finances safe. So I can.
That's an interesting idea.
If other states have done that and whether that's feasible.
Are you on this topic?
Yeah.
Great, Representative
And
Buda.
I was gonna say, to the extent that, would that have to go to the courts? Because if it does, I just think we just need to have this fund pay for some court, funding for the courts to cover this, because they cannot just cover another thing. And the other thing is, I'd like to see something here, for financial literacy built into the thing that the people are holding. So we learned in a summer study that there'll come a time where it pops onto the phone, be sure you're gambling responsibly. That doesn't mean anything to me when I see that. I need to know what that means. So we need information on there that helps people determine whether they're making a choice that's in their financial best interest. Not that we're gonna stop people from making the choices they make, but they need to have some framework for understanding what that means.
Okay, so we're gonna look into possibilities for this and then switching gears, Representative Sims.
Because I'm thinking about two things. One, in the first instance of amendment, the 20%, I understand that is not less than. But I guess thinking about the testimony we've heard from other states, it seems like that's a pretty low number. We might be able to expect a higher number than that. And so I guess I'm wondering about increasing that minimum to like 30. So I'm throwing that out there. And the other thing I've been thinking about is marketing and concerns around what type of increased marketing we might experience in state as this new market is launched. And we have some provisions in the bill around that already. And remembering testimony from New Hampshire where they set sort of maximum marketing budgets. I understand that we also need to be cognizant of the Commerce Clause and what restrictions are around there. So I'm wondering, like, do you have any thoughts or suggestions about what within the Commerce Clause we might do to put some guardrails around marketing?
Sure. The 30-second description of the Commerce Clause boundaries, and we're dealing here with the dormant Commerce Clause, I'm assuming, because you're not trying to directly regulate interstate commerce, but this would be a discriminatory effect potentially on interstate commerce. Essentially, you can't burden interstate commerce through state law, right? That's the basics. And you can't have anything facially discriminatory, so treating out-of-state entities differently than in-state entities. And you can't have any discrimination in effect against products that are made, manufactured, sold in the state versus outside of the state. So you have to treat everything equally in interstate commerce.
And liquor advertising laws, that's nationally regulated, is that the deal?
There are some advertising requirements adopted by the TTB, the Tax and Trade Bureau, that apply to alcoholic beverage advertising. But I will throw the biggest caution flag I can throw about trying to interpret Commerce Clause, First Amendment, and other constitutional issues with respect to alcoholic beverages, which is that there is this wonderful thing called the 21st Amendment that gives the right to regulate alcoholic beverages to the states expressly. And there is a tension between that state power that's built into the U.S. Constitution and other provisions of the Constitution. Commerce Clause still applies. That was a recent case in 2013 that essentially said that even though the states have authority over alcoholic beverages, they still have to comply with the Commerce Clause. And that was an interstate shipping of wine issue.
But here, we're just talking about a market within our state.
Here you're talking about a market within your state. And if you're looking for ways to kind of get at the advertising issues, you're going to be tangling not only with the Commerce Clause, but also with the First Amendment. And my recommendation would be to control your own house first before you target these economic actors. So that is why, for example, the restriction in the bill right now on advertising on post-secondary campuses is directed at the post-secondary schools. It's not directed at the economic actors that are taking out the advertisements. It's telling the schools that are tied to the state, that are instrumentalities of the state, and it's saying, hey, schools that are under our control, you can't sell your advertising space to these particular entities.
And so if we had, say, a state television station, which we don't, and I'm not suggesting we should, and that's a totally different country that we would be operating in, then we could say that to that television station that they cannot have that advertising. Okay.
Or instead of maybe targeting a specific sector of businesses, you would tell that television station they have to adopt guidelines and put some sort of bright line standard in there that doesn't directly target out-of-state actors, in-state actors, and it doesn't target a specific type of speech, but that instead meets some sort of state interest uniformly and is content neutral. So, having said all that, if you were going to control any entity within this bill and attempt to get advertising, you should probably direct it at the Department of Liquor and Lottery as the entity that is going to be offering and controlling this service within the state. And this is already state-controlled market, right? You're not going to be impacting the other states. So that might be something along the lines of directing DLL to adopt an advertising plan as part of the contract.
Part of their contract requests. Okay, thank you. Representative Anthony and then Maslin, is that what you two negotiated?
Yes.
I'd like to fill in the direction you were going in terms of what's not in the bill. And part of that would be to require, as I think Tucker suggested, in the contractual relationship between DLL and whoever operator, that they pay specific attention to the guardrails we've already put in there in terms of age, appropriate ads, and in this case also what's also not in the bill, and I don't know how this should be worked in, but we want the advertising essentially to reinforce the primary interest of the state, which is to bring the black market into the legal framework. How that's rolled in, I leave to DLL, but that is at the moment not part of a preamble of the bill, and yet we've all assumed that that's the point.
Is that not in the bill?
There is no purpose or intent section that describes those things, but there could be, and based on some recent guidance from the Legislative Committee on Administrative Rules, because there is rulemaking adjacent components to this, purpose and intent would help at least guide your legislative committee.
Thank you for reminding me about that, because I got an email about a month ago that I meant to keep top of mind that disappeared. But as we do have a member of Elcar here who perhaps could regularly remind us that we need
I
intent
will
sections.
try to do that because I'm the reason that memo went out. I said,
you.
wait a minute, how are we supposed to find out what the intent is of the legislature when it's past time and people can make, arguments one way or the other? And it was put intent in your bills, especially if that's to go to be, to rule like that.
Delegation.
Yeah, you, and the last word here, and then we're going to move on to a new topic.
Tucker, if there's time, and I don't know if there is, because it's a little bit outside of our immediate discussion, I'd be curious to know the breadcrumb route from prohibition to the 21st Amendment, how that tangles up good, bad, and ugly.
That would be awful.
We should absolutely connect for about a 3-hour long session offline. I can tell you I did it for House GovOps earlier this year with an introduction to Title VII, and it starts with people smashing liquor bottles with stones and passes through the Webb Opinion Act and ends in the 21st Amendment, and it's a fascinating tale.
So I could just go to their tape.
Yeah. Yes.
In a couple of years, maybe Tucker will publish a book that we can all read.
That would be great. Thank
No
you.
time.
Okay.
Thank you.
We're going to take a quick break and then pick back up